Alright, so this video is going to cover Objective 3 of Chapter 12. We're going to be looking at cells of the nervous system. And so there's actually two main types of cells. First we have the neurons, which are kind of the main stars of the nervous system. They are going to be the ones responsible for sending all the messages from the central nervous system to the peripheral and peripheral back to the central nervous system. They are message carriers. But then we're also going to have some support cells known as neuroglial cells, which sometimes we may just simply call neuroglia or glia. And so we're going to start with the neurons, and like I mentioned, they're the ones that are going to be carrying all of the information. They're going to receive stimuli, and then they're going to create what we call action potentials. And so that's essentially going to be that electrical impulse that is carried from the neuron to other neurons, or from a neuron to an effector cell like a muscle. And so they're going to be the ones kind of generating and carrying our information between our sensory environment and our central nervous system, and then carrying the information from the central nervous system out to that peripheral nervous system so that we can cause movement or release of hormones, things like that. And so we're going to start by looking at the neuron, which has a lot of specialized parts. We've actually looked at these already back in Chapter 4, and we talked about 4 of these parts already, but we do have a few more that we're going to add. So you can see that it has a very unique structure, which is going to allow it to perform the function of collecting information and sending electrical signals. And so we're going to start with the cell body, also known as the soma. And so the cell body is going to be this region here. It's kind of like the main bulk part of the cell. And so in the cell body, or the soma, you have the nucleus, the control center, but you also have other organelles like mitochondria, lysosomes, things like that. And so all around the cell body, you have these little extensions, and these are going to be kind of like little satellites, and their job is going to be to receive the information that's coming into the neuron. And so they're bringing in sensory information, or they're receiving information from other neurons. And so we call those our dendrites. Our dendrites are going to be the receivers. And then you can see that the cell body is going to kind of extend out into this tail-like structure that we call the axon. And so the axon is going to be responsible for carrying that message away from the cell body. And so it's going to kind of move that action potential along. Now you can see here in this area, it's not labeled on the diagram, but where the cell body meets the axon, we call that the axon hillock, and that's actually where the action potential is going to be generated. And we'll look at that in more detail when we get to our information about action potentials. And then on the axon, which is all of this, okay, on the axon, we have these little bundles of kind of a fatty material that we call the myelin sheath, and that's going to be an insulator. Think of it like the plastic that surrounds an electrical cord. So when you have like an extension cord, you don't touch the live wire because that could be very dangerous. So we wrap it with plastic, which serves as an insulator, and that's what the myelin sheath does for our axon. Now, it's produced by these little cells called Schwann cells. This is actually going to be in the peripheral nervous system. And so it just kind of wraps around the axon and insulates it. Now, in addition to that, it also speeds up the movement of the action potentials. So when you have a myelinated axon, it allows that electrical signal to move more quickly down the axon. Now, you can see that the whole axon is not covered in myelin. There's actually these little gaps in between, and we call those the nodes of Ranvier. And they actually have lots of ion channels, which are going to allow for ions to move across that membrane, and that's going to be part of transmitting that action potential. And then the axon ends in these little bulbs called axon terminals. And it's at the axon terminals where we're going to see that electrical signal being converted to a chemical signal. So over here, we're either going to have an effector cell, like a muscle, or you could have the dendrites of another neuron. And so that electrical signal can't jump across the space between the neuron and the next cell. And so that's why we're going to have the production of a chemical signal. And that's going to happen at the axon terminals. Now in your packet, you do have a handout on page 109. It's essentially this diagram, but it's blank, and so you may want to use that to practice filling in the parts of the neuron. Not only does it give you the names of the parts, but it also gives you kind of a short description of their functions. So let's just take a second and match up our cell parts. So the cell body was the part that contained the nucleus and the organelles, and so that's going to be D. The nodes of Ranvier, that's going to be the areas on the axon that are not myelinated, they're uninsulated, and they actually have lots of ion channels, so they are going to allow for the diffusion of ions. The Schwann cells were the cells that produced the myelin sheath, and the myelin sheath was the insulation that surrounded the axon, but it also helped to speed up that action potential. And then the axon hillock is going to be where the cell body meets the axon, and that's where the action potential is going to be generated. So there we see that. Now when it comes to our neurons, they're actually bundled together oftentimes. It's not like they're just always individual, and so we will find neurons in both the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system, but when we have these collections, they can give the appearance of different colors within our nervous tissue. And so we call those our gray matter and our white matter. And the difference has to do with the myelin sheath or the myelination. So if you think back to your neurons, the cell body and the dendrites did not have that insulation, but the axons did. And so when you're looking at your nervous tissue, you can see that there's darker areas and there's lighter areas. So the darker area we call the gray matter, and so in the brain, it's mostly going to be on the outside of the brain. In the spinal cord, it's actually kind of in the center area. But the gray matter is going to be those areas that are not myelinated, so it's going to be mostly cell bodies and dendrites. Now, it's not always necessarily gray. It could be a light pink or it could be a tan. It depends on the how long it's been preserved, or if there's any kind of blood supply or anything like that. But it's definitely going to be darker than the white matter. And then the white matter is white because of the fatty myelin that is insulating it. So the myelin actually is a whitish color, and we'll find that on the axons. So if you see the white areas, that's going to be mostly composed of axons. If you see the darker gray areas, that's going to be mostly composed of cell bodies and dendrites. Now we do refer to these collections of nerve tissue a little bit differently depending on whether they are in the central nervous system or the peripheral nervous system. So you're going to have collections of cell bodies, but in the brain and in the spinal cord, we actually call those a nucleus or nuclei. You can see these here in the picture. Okay, so these are our nuclei, which tells us these are going to be bundles of cell bodies. So if it's brain or spinal cord, nuclei is used. Now, a cluster of cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system is called a ganglion, or ganglia if it's plural. And so it's pretty much the same thing. Both of them are collections of cell bodies, but if it's in the central nervous system, it's a nucleus. If it's in the peripheral nervous system, it's a ganglion. The same can be said for the axons. Okay, you're going to have bundles of axons, which are going to make up that white matter. In the central nervous system, we call them tracts, like you can see up here. But in the peripheral nervous system, we call them nerves. And so once again, same kind of structure, but just different division of the nervous system. So this kind of just summarizes what we just talked about. You've got your gray matter and your white matter, and then what we call them, whether they are in the central or the peripheral nervous system. All right, so the cell body of a neuron located in the peripheral nervous system is going to be called, well, it's not going to be C and it's not going to be D because those are our axons. A nerve is a bundle of axons in the peripheral, and a tract is a bundle of axons in the central nervous system. And so we're left with nuclei and ganglia, and if we're talking about peripheral, it's going to be ganglia. And then the axon of a neuron located in the central nervous system. So if we're talking about central nervous system here, and we're talking about axons, so this time we can knock out those two because those are cell bodies. And so if it's in the central nervous system, we're going to call it a tract. All right, what part of the neuron makes up the gray matter? So remember, the white matter is white because of myelin, and so that's going to be your axons. The gray matter is going to be coming from, or being made up of your cell bodies and your dendrites. So that's going to be D. All right, now when it comes to neurons, not all neurons are exactly the same. You can see just by looking at the picture, they don't all have the exact same structure. There are some variations. Some of it has to do with how many extensions they have. They can be unipolar, bipolar, or multipolar. We're not really going to discuss that a whole lot in this lesson, but just the main thing is I want you to recognize that they can come in slightly different shapes and structures. But in terms of function, we can break our neurons down into 3 types. We have sensory neurons, motor neurons, and interneurons. And so these together essentially kind of make up a reflex arc. So your sensory neurons are going to be the ones that are bringing in sensory information. They're carrying information to the central nervous system. So they're collecting sensory information like from our skin or from our senses like our sight or our smell. Now then they're going to carry that information to the central nervous system, and typically an interneuron it's going to be the go-between. Inter means between, and so these are going to be your go-between neurons between the sensory and the motor. And so your interneurons are just going to kind of integrate that incoming signal, and these are only found in the central nervous system. And then your motor neurons are going to be the ones that carry the message back to your peripheral nervous system. They're going to carry it away from the central nervous system, and they're essentially going to tell an effector to do something like a muscle. And so these neurons together kind of create this reflex arc. So you can see here you have a sensory neuron that's carrying information in. Okay, the interneuron is going to process it, and then the motor neuron is going to carry it away. And so kind of like the last one, we do have a diagram on page 11, and you can look at that and label that. I kind of highlighted in green the parts that you need to recognize and label. So once again, you have a typical reflex arc. You have your information coming in. Okay, notice this is called a ganglion because we're in our peripheral nervous system. So our sensory neurons carrying information in, the interneuron is processing, and then the motor neuron is carrying that message back to the peripheral nervous system. All right, so which neurons are located only within the central nervous system? That would be our interneurons. The nucleus of a sensory neuron can be found within the, all right, so the nucleus of a sensory neuron can be found within the, if it's a nucleus, it's going to be found within a ganglia because we're talking about our cell bodies. And then which type of neuron communicates with the effector? That is going to be our motor neuron. All right, so we're also going to go ahead and talk about our neuroglial cells. And so these are going to be your support cells. Now we are going to break them down into our glial cells of the peripheral nervous system and our glial cells of the central nervous system. But essentially they're going to be helpers. Okay, they're going to help support the neuron and keep it safe and help create a steady environment and kind of protect and support it. So there are definitely more glial cells than neurons, and they're going to be all around within our neurons and touching them and surrounding them, but the neurons are going to be the main ones that are transmitting information. And so we're going to start with our central nervous system glial cells. We have our astrocytes, and astro refers to star, and they are star-shaped like you can see in the picture. Okay, and these are going to be very, very important cells. They have multiple functions. They help maintain the chemical concentrations around the neurons. They can help remove excess signaling molecules. They can help react to tissue damage. So like if you do have damage in your nervous system, they can kind of wall off injuries and create these little scars. And they also are responsible for the blood-brain barrier. And so the blood-brain barrier is actually, it's a good thing as a whole because it prevents large things from entering the brain. Like we don't want pathogens or large chemicals or things like that that could be harmful to our nervous tissue. And so the blood-brain barrier actually protects us. But it could also keep things like medications and immune cells out. So The blood-brain barrier is great, but it is something that could be difficult when you're talking about trying to get medications to nervous tissue. And so these astrocytes are responsible for kind of creating that blood-brain barrier that prevents those bad things from entering in the blood. The blood that enters the brain is going to be very specific in what can and cannot enter. And so your astrocytes make up most of the structure of your central nervous system. We also have ependymal cells, and they are ciliated, which means they have these little hairs on them, and the cilia beat back and forth for movement. And what these ependymal cells do is they produce cerebrospinal fluid, which is the fluid that just kind of surrounds our brain and spinal cord and the central nervous system. And so not only do they kind of produce that cerebrospinal fluid, but they also move it around in those cavities. We have oligodendrocytes, which are going to produce myelin. Now, earlier we talked about Schwann cells. Those are going to produce myelin in the peripheral nervous system. So remember that here we're talking about central nervous system. And the oligodendrocytes actually kind of have these long extensions, and that can actually myelinate multiple axons at once. There could be another axon over here, and that oligodendrocyte could also be myelinating another neuron at the same time. But they're essentially going to create that myelin sheath on the neurons of your central nervous system. And then we also have microglia, micro because they're small, and these are actually going to be your immune cells. So a lot of your big macrophages are unable to get to the brain because of their size and that blood-brain barrier. But we do have some immune cells that live within the nervous tissue, and what they do is they phagocytize, that's cell eating, so they essentially engulf like dead tissue or microorganisms and help kind of protect those neurons and other cells of the central nervous system. Now, just an FYI, you don't have to know all the details, but they do vary between males and females a little bit. There's some differences in their structure. Also, we have the disease of multiple sclerosis. This has to do with your myelin sheath. So it's an autoimmune disorder where the body attacks itself, and what it attacks is that myelin. And so what happens is that myelin gets broken down. It's going to affect the transmission of those nerve impulses, which can affect those effector cells. And then the last thing we're going to talk about in this video are the peripheral nervous system glial cells, and there's actually only two here. We have our Schwann cells, which we've already talked about. They're responsible for producing that myelin sheath on those peripheral neurons. Now, they are different from those oligodendrocytes, and that each Schwann cell is only producing one little area of myelin on one axon. So where those oligodendrocytes could myelinate multiple axons at once, these Schwann cells just kind of wrap around the area where they are on the axon, on one axon only. And then we also have satellite cells, and they're called satellites because they're all around like a satellite would be. They're kind of just hanging out around the cell body. And what they're going to do is provide nutrition, and they're also going to protect from some poisons. They're just going to be just some support cells for those peripheral nervous system neurons. And so here's just a general summary of all of your neuroglial cells. You have 4 in the central nervous system and 2 in the peripheral nervous system. And so this will just be a great kind of summary page to study. So just a couple of questions before we wrap it up. Which description refers to oligodendrocytes? Small cells were your microglia. The star-shaped were your astrocytes. Flattened cells that form the myelin are your Schwann cells, and so the answer here is going to be C. And then the phagocytic cells in the CNS are your microglia. And that is going to finish up this video over Objective 3 in Chapter 12.